When WCW closed its doors in 2001, even the most ruthless superstars saw their worlds turned upside down. While we celebrate the legacy of WCW's greatest moments, some of the promotion's most dangerous heels saw their careers take unexpected turns after the Monday Night Wars ended. From genetic freaks with unmatched intensity to psychotic powerhouses who dominated multiple promotions, these villains' stories took dramatic twists no one saw coming. First up, Scott Hall. Scott Hall was one of wrestling's most charismatic performers, revolutionizing the business when he formed the NWO. He went from being a struggling mid-carder to becoming the bad guy Razor Ramon, a cultural icon who carried the Intercontinental Championship with style and swagger. In 2022, at 63 years old, he passed away after being taken off life support. Scott Hall was no doubt one of the greatest, but one question remains unanswered. Why WWE never gave him a world title run? In 1958, Scott Oliver Hall was born in St. Mary's County, Maryland, beginning a nomadic childhood that few could imagine. As the son of a military man constantly receiving new orders, young Scott found himself uprooted and replanted in unfamiliar soil nearly every year until he was 15. Though wrestling captivated his imagination from an early age, the path to the squared circle wasn't immediately clear. After graduation, Scott drifted through life like a ship without anchor, taking whatever work would pay the bills. His imposing frame and natural intimidation factor made him perfect for security work, and he found steady employment guarding the doors of various bars and nightclubs, keeping watch over the rowdy nightlife scene. But fate has a way of violently redirecting our paths when we least expect it. In 1983, while working security at an Orlando nightclub, Hall's life changed forever during one fateful shift. What began as routine crowd control escalated into a life-or-death struggle that ended with Hall firing his weapon in self-defense. The patron died from his wounds. Though initially charged with second-degree murder, the case was eventually dismissed when investigators confirmed Hall had acted to protect himself. But legal exoneration couldn't erase the psychological damage. This traumatic incident would cast a long shadow across Hall's future. His closest confidant, Kevin Nash, would later point to this moment as the catalyst for the demons that would eventually hunt Hall throughout his career, the addiction issues that nearly consumed him. How do you move forward when you've taken a life, even justifiably? It's a question Hall would spend decades trying to answer. Seeking escape and reinvention, Hall made the pivotal decision to pursue professional wrestling in 1984. Championship Wrestling from Florida recognized the untapped potential in this physically imposing newcomer with natural charisma. Immediately, they thrust him into the spotlight with a high-profile feud against the legendary Dusty Rhodes, baptism by fire for any wrestling rookie. What followed was a wrestling education unlike any other, as Hall traversed the territory system alongside tag team partner Dan Spivey, absorbing different styles and approaches, building the foundation for what would become one of wrestling's most influential careers. In 1985, after bouncing between promotions like a pinball, including stops at Jim Crockett Promotions in the Carolinas and Midwest Wrestling Association in Missouri, Hall landed in what many consider wrestling's prestigious finishing school, Vern Gaines' American Wrestling Association. This wasn't just another territory. The AWA stood as one of wrestling's powerhouse organizations, a breeding ground for superstars where legends were forged. Here, Hall underwent his first major character transformation. Who was this mustachioed powerhouse commanding attention? None other than Magnum Scott Hall, a fan favorite whose uncanny resemblance to television heartthrob Tom Selleck became his calling card. Behind the scenes, something remarkable was happening. Vern Gaines, with his legendary eye for talent, saw something special in Hall that few others had recognized. Whispers circulated throughout the locker room that Gagne believed he'd discovered his next Hulk Hogan, the superstar who'd slipped through his fingers years earlier. How serious was Gagne about this vision? Serious enough to personally instruct Hall to incorporate Hogan-esque moves and mannerisms into his performances, hoping lightning might strike twice. The strategy initially paid dividends. Hall's career trajectory soared as he formed a formidable partnership with the technically brilliant Curt Hennig, creating magic in the ring night after night. When that alliance eventually dissolved, Hall didn't miss a beat, transitioning seamlessly into singles competition where he quickly ascended the ranks. Before long, this former drifter found himself standing across the ring from legendary champions like the fearsome Stan Hansen and the technically superior Rick Martel, challenging for wrestling's most coveted prize, the AWA World Championship. What made Hall different from other physically imposing wrestlers wasn't just his look or his size. It was an intangible quality that made fans believe in him, a natural charisma that couldn't be taught. Though championship gold remained just beyond his grasp during this period, something more valuable was happening. Scott Hall was becoming a complete performer, developing the tools that would eventually make him one of wrestling's most influential figures. By 1989, Scott Hall's wrestling instincts weren't limited to the ring. His business acumen had sharpened too. Despite his growing popularity in the AWA, Hall recognized the warning signs: dwindling crowds, bounced paychecks, and an organization struggling to stay relevant in a rapidly changing industry. The once mighty AWA was taking on water fast. Would you stay aboard a sinking vessel when your career was at stake? What followed was a professional wrestler's version of a world tour, as Hall transformed himself into a wrestling nomad, testing waters across the globe. His journey began with a 6-month stint at World Championship Wrestling, where he first crossed paths with the Atlanta-based promotion that would later define his legacy. But the odyssey was just beginning. Like a master craftsman seeking new techniques, Hall expanded his wrestling education overseas. He battled in the technically demanding rings of New Japan Pro Wrestling, where Western showmanship met Eastern fighting spirit. Then it was off to Germany's Catch Wrestling Association, where the hard-hitting European style added new weapons to his arsenal. The sun-soaked arenas of Puerto Rico's World Wrestling Council saw him perform before passionate Caribbean crowds. He even participated in a WWE tryout that, puzzlingly, didn't immediately lead to a contract. What were they missing that they'd later regret? By 1991, Hall's compass pointed him back to WCW, where his evolution continued with the birth of the Diamond Stud, a character dripping with arrogance and machismo that channeled the cocky essence of Rick Rude. With the flamboyant Diamond Dallas Page as his manager and mouthpiece, this new incarnation of Hall cut through WCW's mid-card talent like Tommy Rich and Tom Zenk with devastating efficiency. It was during this return to WCW that wrestling history quietly began writing its most influential chapter. Hall formed a brief but significant partnership with another imposing figure using the moniker Vinny Vegas, none other than Kevin Nash. Though neither man could have known it then, this temporary alliance was merely the prelude to a friendship that would eventually reshape the wrestling industry. Despite finding his groove in WCW, when opportunity knocked in the form of a WWE contract in May 1992, Hall didn't hesitate. Sometimes success requires perfect timing, and Hall sensed that his moment had arrived. With his bags packed and his sights set on the biggest wrestling company in the world, Scott Hall prepared to answer the most important call of his career, one that would transform him from a wrestling journeyman into a household name. In May 1992, Scott Hall stepped onto WWE's grand stage as Razor Ramon, a character that would forever change wrestling history. But here's what makes it fascinating. This wasn't just another gimmick handed down from creative. The slick-talking, gold chain-wearing bad guy sprang directly from Hall's own imagination after immersing himself in Al Pacino's iconic portrayal of Tony Montana in Scarface. How many wrestlers create their own defining personas? Say hello to the bad guy. With those words, delivered in his perfect Pacino-inspired Cuban accent, Hall instantly captivated audiences. While other newcomers struggled to find their footing, Razor Ramon exploded onto the scene with a fully realized character. His methodical dismantling of WWE's undercard talent wasn't just about winning matches. It was calculated character building that made him look absolutely lethal. Each toothpick flicked at fallen opponents told a story of arrogance and superiority that audiences couldn't ignore. Something unexpected started happening during those early months. Despite being positioned as a villain, fans couldn't help but admire him. What makes certain bad guys so irresistible? Razor's swagger, confidence, and undeniable coolness made him one of wrestling's earliest examples of a cool heel. Someone fans secretly cheered despite their villainous actions. His perfectly slicked back hair, dazzling gold chains, and signature catchphrases created an aura that transcended traditional wrestling roles. WWE recognized they had something special and wasted no time throwing their new acquisition into the deep end. On September 14, 1992, primetime wrestling viewers witnessed Razor Ramon insert himself into wrestling royalty when he cost the beloved Macho Man Randy Savage a crucial match against the Nature Boy Ric Flair. Interfering against a legend like Savage wasn't just any debut feud. It was an immediate signal that management viewed Hall as main event material. This high-profile rivalry culminated at that year's Survivor Series, where the wrestling world witnessed something extraordinary: a tag team collision featuring Razor and Flair battling against Savage and Mr. Perfect. Can you imagine a better spotlight for a newcomer? Sharing the ring with three certified legends, Hall didn't just keep pace, he belonged there. The match accomplished exactly what it needed to, establishing Razor Ramon as more than just another new face. He was a superstar destined for greatness. Behind that confident smirk and those intimidating eyes, Scott Hall was proving what insiders had long suspected. He possessed one of wrestling's most brilliant creative minds. His innate understanding of character development, psychology, and presentation was creating something that would resonate with fans for decades to come. Little did anyone know, Razor Ramon was just the beginning of Scott Hall's revolutionary impact on professional wrestling. Following his impressive showing against Macho Man, Vince McMahon fast-tracked Razor Ramon straight into WWE's championship picture. The 1993 Royal Rumble saw the bad guy challenge none other than technical mastermind Bret Hitman Hart for the coveted WWE Championship. Although Hall didn't capture the gold that night, something more valuable occurred. The match convinced skeptics that this newcomer belonged in main events. By summer 1993, fan reaction had become impossible to ignore. WWE executives recognized a golden opportunity when a seemingly routine match against an unknown jobber named the 1-2-3 Kid created magic. Remember that shocking moment when the undersized underdog somehow pinned the mighty Razor Ramon on Monday Night Raw? The upset victory didn't just launch Sean Waltman's career, it provided the perfect storyline catalyst for Hall's character evolution. Instead of responding with anger, Razor showed unexpected sportsmanship. His growing respect for the young upstart who had embarrassed him transformed naturally into a full babyface turn. Fans who had been secretly cheering could now openly embrace the bad guy as one of their favorites. The former rivals even formed an unlikely partnership, teaming together against common enemies. Behind the curtain, something equally significant was developing. The on-screen partnership between Hall and Waltman mirrored a growing real-life friendship. They soon found themselves gravitating toward like-minded performers: Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, and an up-and-coming Triple H. Together, they formed what wrestling insiders would come to know as the Kliq. This wasn't just another backstage friendship. The Kliq quietly accumulated unprecedented influence within WWE's power structure. Their collective star power, creative input, and strategic positioning gave them the kind of backstage pull that wrestling had rarely seen before. At times, industry veterans wondered who truly controlled WWE's direction. Was it Vince McMahon or this tight-knit group of performers who protected each other's interests? How much control should wrestlers have over their own storylines? As Razor Ramon's popularity soared on screen, Scott Hall's backstage influence grew proportionally. The cool character fans adored, and the shrewd businessman behind it were both ascending simultaneously, setting the stage for one of wrestling's most consequential careers, and one of its most turbulent personal journeys. The moment Scott Hall truly cemented his place in WWE history was on October 11, 1993, when he defeated former AWA rival Rick Martel to claim his first Intercontinental Championship. It wasn't just another title change, it was validation. After years of wandering the wrestling landscape, Hall had not only found his perfect character but earned championship gold that proved his exceptional talent. But a championship reign rarely comes without controversy. When suspended former champion Shawn Michaels returned, he brought an unexpected claim. Since no one had actually defeated him for the title, wasn't he still the rightful champion? 2 championship belts, 2 elite performers, and one unprecedented solution. How would WWE determine the true champion? The answer revolutionized professional wrestling forever. At WrestleMania 10, Razor Ramon and Shawn Michaels climbed into Madison Square Garden and shattered expectations in WWE's first ever pay-per-view ladder match. While modern fans might take ladder matches for granted, imagine being in that arena witnessing something completely new. What happens when 2 of wrestling's most innovative minds are given freedom to create without a blueprint to follow? Magic happened. Their bodies told a story of risk, sacrifice, and championship desire that transcended traditional wrestling. Each painful impact and death-defying leap served a greater narrative purpose. Though Razor emerged victorious as the undisputed Intercontinental Champion, both men walked away as winners. They'd created a template that wrestlers would follow for decades to come. How do you follow up perfection? Razor's momentum carried him into a program with another Kliq member, Diesel. Their contrasting styles, Ramon's technical prowess against Nash's raw power, created compelling television throughout the remainder of 1994, further elevating the Intercontinental Championship's prestige. Behind Hall's confident smirk lay a performer at the absolute peak of his powers, respected by peers, adored by fans, and pioneering new forms of in-ring storytelling that would influence generations of wrestlers. The question wasn't if Scott Hall would leave a legacy, but how monumental that legacy would become. Scott Hall's career reached a turning point after his SummerSlam 1995 ladder match with Shawn Michaels. Despite delivering wrestling classics against opponents like Jeff Jarrett, frustration quietly built as Hall watched his friends Nash and Michaels ascend to world championship status while he remained locked in the upper mid-card. The breaking point came when Hall directly approached Vince McMahon, asking what more he could do to reach the next level. McMahon's response was devastating. This was it. In McMahon's vision, Razor Ramon had reached his permanent position in the hierarchy. Meanwhile, WCW's Eric Bischoff was aggressively recruiting WWE talent with Ted Turner's financial backing. Hall wasn't just creatively frustrated. Kevin Nash revealed that financial concerns played a major role too, with both men feeling underpaid despite their drawing power. By early 1996, both Hall and Nash submitted their resignations to WWE. Their final appearance would become wrestling legend, the infamous curtain call incident at Madison Square Garden, where the Kliq broke character to embrace publicly, shattering wrestling's sacred kayfabe. With his WWE contract expired and determined to prove his true value, Scott Hall prepared to make one of the most industry-altering impacts in professional wrestling history. What followed would shake professional wrestling to its core. On May 27, 1996, during an episode of Monday Nitro, Scott Hall emerged unexpectedly from the crowd. Dressed in street clothes rather than wrestling gear, he calmly stepped into the ring, grabbed a microphone, and delivered one of wrestling's most iconic promos. With his distinctive swagger, he warned WCW that he and some friends were coming to take over. 2 weeks later, Kevin Nash joined him, solidifying what fans would come to know as the Outsiders. The brilliance of this angle was its blurring of reality and fiction. Though both men were legitimately no longer employed by WWE, the storyline implied they were invaders sent by the competition. This worked-shoot approach created unprecedented buzz throughout the wrestling world. Were these actual WWE wrestlers invading? Was this real? The ambiguity fueled fan speculation and dramatically boosted ratings. Then came the moment that truly changed wrestling forever. At Bash at the Beach on July 7th, Hall and Nash promised a mystery partner for their 6-man tag match. When Hulk Hogan, wrestling's biggest hero for over a decade, emerged as their ally and turned villain for the first time since becoming a mainstream star, the audience's shock was palpable. As fans pelted the ring with garbage, Hogan proclaimed the formation of the New World Order, declaring war on WCW. The NWO storyline transcended typical wrestling narratives. Its gritty realism, cool factor, and anti-establishment attitude perfectly captured the emerging cultural zeitgeist of the late 1990s. The angle was so convincing that local authorities occasionally received calls reporting real assaults when NWO members attacked wrestlers backstage. People who had never watched wrestling before suddenly couldn't look away. Behind the scenes, Hall's creative fingerprints were all over the NWO concept. His understanding of character psychology, storytelling, and what fans truly wanted to see helped craft what many consider wrestling's most influential angle. The storyline didn't just change WCW, it forced WWE to evolve into the Attitude Era and transformed how wrestling stories would be told for generations to come. But Hall's creative genius extended beyond his own character. The NWO needed a worthy adversary, and it was reportedly Scott Hall who conceived what would become one of wrestling's most iconic transformations. At his suggestion, Sting abandoned his colorful surfer persona and emerged as a silent, brooding vigilante inspired by Brandon Lee's character in The Crow. This reinvention created the perfect counterbalance to the NWO's chaos, a dark avenger lurking in the rafters, waiting to deliver justice. Before that epic confrontation would materialize, the NWO continued expanding its ranks. The faction welcomed Scott's old friend Sean Waltman, now competing as Six, further strengthening the original Outsiders core. With their growing army, Hall and Nash dominated WCW's tag team division, capturing the tag team championships an impressive 6 times. Their battles against legendary teams like Harlem Heat, the technically superior Steiner brothers, and the prestigious Four Horsemen produced some of the era's most memorable matches. But as Hall's professional star reached its zenith, his personal demons grew increasingly difficult to conceal. The substance abuse issues that had followed him throughout his career intensified dramatically without WWE's strict oversight. What began as a controlled habit escalated into a dependency that became painfully apparent even to television viewers. His speech slurred during promos, his movements grew erratic, and his once imposing physique began deteriorating before fans' eyes. Behind the spectacular character and innovative mind existed a man fighting battles far more challenging than any wrestling opponent. The contrast between the charismatic performer who revolutionized wrestling and the struggling individual behind the character revealed the profound human cost hidden beneath wrestling's theatrical exterior. After WrestleMania, the NWO storyline crumbled when Hulk Hogan unexpectedly turned babyface and abandoned the group. Desperate to salvage their momentum, Hall and Nash recruited fellow Kliq member Sean Waltman once again, attempting to recapture their faction's former glory. But the angle had lost its spark. By summer, WWE quietly dropped the NWO from television altogether. For Scott Hall, the end came even sooner. On May 7th, his WWE return came to an abrupt halt following the notorious plane ride from hell incident. During the transatlantic flight returning from England, Hall's behavior reportedly spiraled out of control. Alongside several other wrestlers, his actions created such chaos that WWE executives had finally reached their breaking point. The company terminated his contract immediately. Unemployed once again, Hall surveyed a wrestling landscape with increasingly limited options. He eventually landed in the fledgling Total Nonstop Action Wrestling promotion, making sporadic appearances during their 2002 launch period. These brief TNA stints continued through 2004 and 2005, though never developing into consistent programming. The years between major appearances weren't entirely lost time. Behind the scenes, Hall engaged in multiple attempts at rehabilitation. Though lasting sobriety remained elusive, these efforts demonstrated his awareness of his condition and desire to improve. Each attempt to get clean represented a personal battle far more challenging than any in-ring confrontation. On November 1, 2007, a healthier-looking Scott Hall returned to TNA television. Fans witnessed a meaningful reunion as he joined forces with longtime friend Kevin Nash to battle the Angle Alliance. For those who had followed Hall's struggles, seeing him back in action, even temporarily, provided a glimmer of hope that the man behind the wrestler might finally be winning his most important fight. Following that brief return, Hall's reliability issues resurfaced when he no-showed scheduled appearances, severely damaging his relationship with TNA. The promotion kept him off television until January 2010, when he made a surprise comeback to form the band with Nash and Waltman, a thinly veiled recreation of their NWO Kliq glory days. Despite Hulk Hogan's storyline attempts to remove Hall and Waltman from TNA programming, the band continued their disruptive path, launching attacks on various roster members. Their chaos culminated on May 13th, when the reunited Outsiders captured the TNA World Tag Team Championships. However, their reign would be short-lived. By June 14th, TNA stripped them of the titles following Hall's release from the company. Once again, Hall's ongoing substance abuse problems had derailed his career. This time, however, he recognized his desperate need for intervention. In a moment of clarity, he reached out to WWE, taking advantage of their policy that funded rehabilitation for former talent regardless of their current employment status. This rehabilitation stay revealed a shocking medical complication. After battling a serious case of double pneumonia, doctors diagnosed Hall with epilepsy, a condition likely triggered by years of alcohol abuse. This diagnosis required him to begin a daily regimen of medications to control seizures, adding another layer of complexity to his already challenging health situation. And as if that wasn't bad enough, Hall also required a pacemaker during this period, creating yet another life-threatening health concern. His survival now depended on maintaining sobriety and following strict medical protocols, a challenge that proved overwhelming. Despite his awareness of these dangers, addiction's grip remained powerful. The following years brought multiple relapses, including a frightening April 2011 hospitalization after suffering cardiac issues triggered by an overdose. In 2013, when Hall's prospects seemed bleakest, salvation arrived through an unexpected source: Diamond Dallas Page. By this time, DDP had transformed himself from wrestling star to wellness advocate, having already helped Jake the Snake Roberts achieve sobriety after decades of substance abuse. When Page extended the same lifeline to Hall, offering him residence at his Atlanta home and a chance at rehabilitation, Hall recognized this might be his final opportunity. The transformation that followed was nothing short of remarkable. Within months, the physical and mental improvements were visible to everyone. Through a comprehensive approach combining therapy, detoxification, and DDP's innovative yoga program, Page accomplished what numerous rehabilitation facilities couldn't. He helped Scott Hall reclaim his life. The wrestling community rallied around Hall's recovery efforts. Through crowdfunding, DDP raised nearly $110,000 to cover essential medical procedures Hall desperately needed: hip replacement surgery and extensive dental work. These interventions addressed years of physical neglect and helped restore not just Hall's health but his dignity. The transformation in Scott Hall was nothing short of miraculous. Now sober and healthier than he'd been in decades, he re-emerged into the wrestling world to find an overwhelming outpouring of support from fans and industry colleagues alike. His journey toward redemption reached a powerful milestone in 2014 when WWE announced his induction into their Hall of Fame under the Razor Ramon persona. On April 5, 2014, Hall received his long-overdue recognition in a deeply emotional ceremony. Surrounded by his Kliq brothers on stage, he delivered one of wrestling's most memorable induction speeches, his signature catchphrase: "Bad times don't last, but bad guys do," taking on profound new meaning. The celebration wasn't just about his in-ring achievements. It marked the triumph of a man who had fought his way back from the edge of destruction. Since that night, with occasional minor setbacks, Hall has maintained his sobriety. The transformation extended beyond physical health, revealing a man at peace with both his legendary contributions to wrestling and his personal journey. His pride shifted to watching his son Cody Hall forge his own path in promotions like New Japan Pro Wrestling and Pro Wrestling Noah. Hall hasn't vanished completely from wrestling. He makes periodic appearances at WWE events, typically alongside his former Kliq or NWO teammates. These nostalgic moments remind fans of his enduring impact, not just as a consistently excellent performer when healthy, but as one of wrestling's most brilliant creative minds who developed iconic characters and played an instrumental role in crafting the revolutionary NWO storyline that changed professional wrestling forever. Why did Scott Hall never become world champion? This is perhaps wrestling's most fascinating what-if scenario. When Hall debuted as Razor Ramon, WWE immediately positioned him alongside main event talents like Ric Flair and Randy Savage. Throughout his WWE run, he remained at the near pinnacle of the card, delivering classic matches and memorable feuds. His Intercontinental Championship ladder matches with Shawn Michaels revolutionized the industry. The puzzle pieces were all there. Hall possessed the perfect combination of size, in-ring ability, and charisma. His microphone work was exceptional, and fans responded to him whether as heel or face. Yet the World Championship remained elusive. In WWE, timing worked against him. The company was investing heavily in Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and Diesel as their champions during Hall's peak years. When Hall approached Vince McMahon about advancing beyond the upper mid-card, McMahon's response revealed the ceiling WWE had placed on him. WCW presented new opportunities, but new obstacles emerged. As a founding NWO member, Hall became one of wrestling's biggest stars during the industry's hottest period. However, the spotlight often centered on Hogan, while Hall's escalating personal struggles made him increasingly unreliable. Jim Ross often said reliability was wrestling's most crucial trait for top champions. Hall's addiction issues, resulting in multiple DUIs and extended absences, made entrusting him with a world championship an enormous risk. Eric Bischoff, despite valuing Hall creatively, couldn't justify putting the company's centerpiece around his waist. The missed storytelling opportunities are heartbreaking to consider. A Hall rebellion against Hogan's leadership could have created compelling television. A championship program with Nash after the Goldberg streak ended might have elevated both men. Instead, Hall remained the extraordinary talent who never quite secured wrestling's ultimate prize. The cruel irony is that among the Kliq members and original NWO founders, Hall may have been the most complete performer. His combination of size, technical ability, character work, and audience connection was unmatched. What separated him from championship glory wasn't talent, but the personal demons that haunted him throughout his career. In March 2022, wrestling fans around the world were devastated when Scott Hall passed away at the age of 63. His death came after a series of health complications following hip replacement surgery. Hall had been hospitalized after suffering 3 heart attacks on March 12, 2022. These cardiac events occurred when a blood clot was dislodged during his hip surgery. He was placed on life support at Wellstar Kennestone Hospital in Marietta, Georgia, as his condition deteriorated. On March 14, 2022, his longtime friend and fellow wrestling legend Kevin Nash announced on social media that Hall's family had made the difficult decision to discontinue life support once all his loved ones could gather to say goodbye. Next up, Scott Steiner. What if I told you that one of the most genetically gifted wrestlers in history was on the verge of becoming WWE champion, only to have his career destroyed by a single backstage decision? This is the story of how Scott Steiner went from being one of WCW's biggest stars to a forgotten mid-carder overnight. Scott Carl Rex Steiner was born on July 29, 1962, in Bay City, Michigan, into a working-class German-American family that valued hard work and discipline above everything else. His father worked blue-collar jobs to support the family, and his mother made sure Scott and his brother Rick understood that success came through dedication and sweat. The Rex-Steiner household wasn't wealthy, but it was structured. There were rules to follow and expectations to meet. Scott's high school years at Bay City Western showed a kid who had it all figured out. He dominated in both wrestling and football, showing the kind of natural athleticism that coaches dream about finding. On the wrestling mat, Scott was technically sound and physically imposing for his age. He understood leverage and positioning in ways that separated him from other high school wrestlers. His football coaches loved his intensity and work ethic. Scott played multiple positions and never complained about the workload. He was the type of athlete who made everyone around him better just by showing up ready to compete every single day. Even back then, there were signs of the intensity that would later consume him. Teammates remember Scott as someone who never knew when to quit. After regular practice ended, Scott would stay behind to work on specific moves or conditioning drills, pushing his body to limits that worried his coaches. His high school wrestling coach once had to physically remove Scott from the wrestling room because he refused to stop training after a particularly grueling practice session. The drive that impressed his coaches also concerned them at times. Scott would get visibly frustrated when he lost matches or didn't execute techniques perfectly, taking losses personally in ways that seemed unhealthy for a teenager. At the University of Michigan from 1983 to 1986, Scott took his athletic abilities to the next level. He became an NCAA Division I All-American wrestler. He placed 6th nationally in 1986 and was a 3-time Big Ten runner-up. This achievement put Scott among the elite college wrestlers in the country. The competition at Michigan was intense, with wrestlers from across the nation competing for starting positions. Scott not only earned his spot on the team but became one of their best performers. Scott served as team captain during his time at Michigan, which demonstrated leadership qualities that his coaches recognized. Being captain of a Division I wrestling team requires more than just athletic ability. You have to motivate teammates, represent the program, and handle the pressure that comes with being the face of the team. Scott's teammates respected his work ethic and his results on the mat. He led by example, showing up early for practice and staying late to work on technique. His coaches trusted him to help younger wrestlers develop their skills and understand what it took to compete at the highest levels. While excelling athletically, Scott was also earning education credits, eyeing a teaching career before pro wrestling called. This career path was a far cry from the big Papa Pump character he'd later become. Scott was serious about his studies and maintained good grades despite the demanding schedule of being a Division I athlete. He understood that wrestling wouldn't last forever and wanted to have a stable career after his competitive days ended. The idea of Scott Steiner as a high school teacher seems impossible now, but that was genuinely his plan during college. The transformation from future teacher to professional wrestler started when Scott and his brother Rick began planning their move into professional wrestling during their college years. Rick had already shown interest in the wrestling business, and Scott initially wasn't sure about following that path. But as his amateur wrestling career wound down, Scott started considering the possibility of turning professional. The brothers began researching the wrestling business and making contacts with people who could help them get started. Scott's early wrestling training began with Dr. Jerry Graham Jr. in Toledo, Ohio, who provided him with the foundational skills needed to succeed in professional wrestling. This training focused on performance psychology and in-ring storytelling, showing Scott the shift from amateur to pro style. Professional wrestling required him to learn how to work with opponents instead of against them, how to tell stories through matches, and how to connect with audiences. Scott's amateur background gave him legitimate athletic credibility, but he had to learn an entirely new set of skills to succeed as a professional wrestler. The combination of Scott's NCAA All-American status and his academic background created a unique foundation for his wrestling career. He had legitimate athletic credentials that set him apart from wrestlers who were purely entertainers. At the same time, his education studies showed he could think strategically and understand complex concepts. This clean-cut academic achiever was about to enter a world that would completely change who he was as a person. What Scott and Rick were building together would soon shake up the entire wrestling industry. The brothers entered professional wrestling in 1986 and revolutionized what tag team wrestling could be. When Scott and Rick started out, they struggled at first, working small independent shows and learning the business the hard way. The transition from amateur wrestling to professional wrestling wasn't easy for either brother. They had to learn how to work with opponents instead of against them. They had to understand crowd psychology and how to tell stories through their matches. Most importantly, they had to develop a style that would make them stand out from all the other tag teams trying to make it in the business. The early days were tough for the Steiner brothers. They worked shows in small towns for very little money. Sometimes they'd drive hours to wrestle in front of 50 people in a high school gym. But these experiences taught them valuable lessons about the wrestling business. They learned how to connect with audiences and how to work different styles of matches. Scott's amateur wrestling background helped him understand the technical aspects of the business, but he still had to learn how to make everything look exciting for the crowd. But by 1988, something clicked. They developed a hard-hitting, athletic style that no other tag team could match. The Steiner brothers combined Scott's technical skills with Rick's raw power to create something completely new. Their matches were stiffer than most tag team contests. They hit harder and moved faster than teams that had been wrestling for years. Scott brought legitimate wrestling credentials to their matches, while Rick provided the intensity and aggression that made their offense look devastating. Scott innovated moves that are still used today, including the Frankensteiner in the late 1980s. His Frankensteiner Hurricane Rana became an instant highlight. The move showed off his incredible athleticism as he would leap onto an opponent's shoulders and flip them backward in a Hurricane Rana-style move that looked impossible when done correctly. Very few wrestlers had the combination of strength, balance, and timing needed to execute the move safely. Scott made it look easy, but it required years of practice to perfect. The move became so associated with Scott that other wrestlers would try to copy it without understanding the mechanics. Most failed attempts looked awkward or dangerous. Scott's version was smooth and impactful every time. The Frankensteiner became a highlight reel move that crowds expected to see in every Steiner Brothers match. It also established Scott as an innovator who could create moves that other wrestlers would spend years trying to master. Their matches against teams like the Road Warriors and Doom became instant classics, with Scott's technical skills perfectly complementing Rick's raw power. The Road Warriors were considered the most dominant tag team in wrestling at the time, but the Steiner brothers proved they could match their intensity with brutal affairs that showcased both teams' physical abilities. The matches with Doom were equally impressive, often going 15 to 20 minutes and telling complete stories from start to finish. From 1988 to 1995, they dominated everywhere they went. WCW, WWF, New Japan Pro Wrestling, even ECW couldn't get enough of them. The Steiner brothers captured their first major championship when they defeated the Fabulous Freebirds for the NWA WCW World Tag Team titles on November 1, 1989. This victory established them as legitimate championship contenders and marked the beginning of their championship dominance across multiple promotions. Their success in WCW led to opportunities in other promotions. They won the IWGP Tag Team Championship in New Japan Pro Wrestling, which showed they could adapt their style to different wrestling cultures. Japanese fans appreciated their technical skills and hard-hitting approach. The Steiners' matches in Japan were often given more time than American matches, allowing them to showcase their full range of abilities. The WWF run from 1992 to 1994 brought them to national television on a regular basis. They appeared on the first episode of Monday Night Raw and quickly established themselves as top contenders in the WWF's tag team division. They won the WWF Tag Team Championship twice during their run, proving they could succeed in the WWF's sports entertainment environment, as well as WCW's more athletic presentation. They won championships across multiple promotions and were recognized as the most athletic tag team in wrestling history. Wrestling magazines regularly ranked them as the best tag team in the world during their peak years. Their combination of legitimate athletic credentials and entertaining matches made them favorites with both fans and wrestling journalists. They could work technical matches that satisfied hardcore wrestling fans and exciting brawls that entertained casual viewers. Scott's work during this period showed a wrestler at the peak of his technical abilities, executing complex moves with perfect precision. He was following bodybuilding routines designed to pack on mass, not the functional strength training that had made him such an effective wrestler. The change in his physique was obvious to everyone who saw him, but what worried people more was how consumed he was becoming with the process. Scott would talk constantly about his workouts, his diet, and his progress in building muscle. But the real warning signs were behavioral. He started having backstage disagreements about creative direction and questioned booking decisions more aggressively. Scott had always been professional about taking direction from bookers and working whatever storylines they gave him. That started changing in 1995. He began questioning why certain matches were booked the way they were. He wanted to know why the Steiner brothers weren't getting better storylines or more prominent positions on shows. These weren't casual questions either. Scott was becoming confrontational about booking decisions he didn't like. The discussions backstage weren't friendly conversations about creative direction. Scott was becoming more demanding and less willing to accept explanations from bookers and producers. He started pushing for changes to storylines and match finishes, and people in management positions found themselves having to deal with Scott's complaints and demands on a regular basis. His off-screen intensity was rising in ways that went beyond normal backstage politics. By 1996, Scott's suspended license arrest showed how his real-world behavior was becoming as volatile as his backstage outbursts. Fellow wrestlers noticed that Scott's attitude toward the business was shifting from professional to personal, and his unpredictable reactions were making him harder to work with in any situation. His relationship with Rick became strained as Scott pushed for more individual recognition and grew frustrated with their tag team limitations. The Steiner brothers had been incredibly successful as a team, but Scott was starting to feel held back by the tag team format. He wanted singles matches and individual storylines that would showcase his abilities without having to share the spotlight with Rick. These conversations between the brothers weren't always friendly, and people backstage could sense tension between them that hadn't existed before. Scott started expressing frustration about being limited to tag team wrestling when he felt capable of succeeding as a singles wrestler. He'd point to other wrestlers who had transitioned from tag teams to successful singles careers and wonder why the Steiner brothers weren't being given similar opportunities. Rick was more content with their tag team success, which created friction between them about the direction of their careers. The intense training regimen Scott adopted wasn't just about getting stronger. It was becoming an obsession that consumed his free time. People who knew Scott outside of wrestling noticed that he had less time for anything that wasn't related to bodybuilding or wrestling. His entire schedule revolved around training, eating to support his muscle growth, and recovering from workouts. This level of dedication went beyond what was necessary for professional wrestling and entered territory that seemed unhealthy. Scott's obsession with building muscle was taking over other aspects of his life. He would schedule social activities around his training schedule. He'd turn down invitations to events if they conflicted with his gym time. The physical transformation was impressive, but the single-minded focus on bodybuilding was concerning to people who cared about him. People in the locker room started walking on eggshells around Scott, unsure which version of him they'd encounter on any given day. The unpredictability of Scott's moods was creating an uncomfortable atmosphere backstage. Wrestlers who had been friends with Scott for years found themselves being more careful about what they said around them. Nobody wanted to accidentally set him off or get into a confrontation with someone who was becoming increasingly volatile. These warning signs were building towards something that would change everything Scott had worked for. All the frustration, obsession, and growing resentment were about to explode in a way that would destroy relationships and create a character nobody saw coming. In 1998, Scott Steiner did something that still shocks fans who watch it back. He completely destroyed everything he'd built with his brother. The heel turn wasn't just a storyline decision. It was Scott channeling his real-life frustrations into a character that let him express his darkest impulses. All those personality changes we saw building up over the previous years were about to explode onto television screens across the country. Scott had been looking for a way to break out as a singles wrestler, and turning heel gave him the perfect opportunity to do it. The transformation started with Scott's physical appearance. He packed on even more muscle mass and grew a goatee that made him look more intimidating. Then came the bleached blonde hair and beard that became his trademark look. This wasn't just a simple dye job either. Scott went platinum blonde in a way that made him stand out from every other wrestler on the roster. Scott was now trapped in a character that required him to maintain an impossible physical standard. He had to keep getting bigger and more muscular to maintain the image he'd created. This meant more time in the gym, more focus on his physique, and less attention paid to his actual wrestling skills. The character was successful, but it was also limiting Scott's ability to be a well-rounded performer. Scott's promos during this period were rambling and often incoherent, but they had an intensity that made them impossible to ignore. He would go off on tangents that didn't make logical sense, but his delivery was so passionate that fans couldn't look away. Scott mixed mathematics with sexual bragging in ways that defied logic, creating some of the most memorable and quotable promos in wrestling history. These promos were often difficult to follow, but they were undeniably entertaining. The mathematical elements of Scott's promos became legendary among wrestling fans. He would calculate percentages and odds in ways that didn't add up mathematically, but his confidence in delivering these calculations made them compelling television. Scott would claim to have a certain percentage chance of winning matches based on his superior genetics and training. These promos were nonsensical, but they were delivered with such conviction that they became part of wrestling folklore. The success of the character was immediate. Scott became a memorable figure in WCW and eventually became the interim leader of NWO Hollywood during Hulk Hogan's absence. The transformation allowed Scott to break out as a singles wrestler and eventually win the WCW Championship in 2000. From a career perspective, the Big Papa Pump character was exactly what Scott needed to reach the next level. Big Papa Pump wasn't just a character. It was Scott Steiner unleashing parts of his personality that he'd kept hidden for years. But as successful as the character became, it also revealed how Scott's relationship with reality was becoming increasingly strained. His promos were getting stranger, his behavior more unpredictable, and his ability to separate character from reality was disappearing entirely. The Steiner math promo wasn't just a one-off moment. It was the perfect example of how Scott's mind was working during his WCW peak. By 1999 and 2000, Scott had developed this weird habit of incorporating mathematical calculations into his promos that made absolutely no sense when you actually tried to follow the logic. At Fall Brawl 2000, Scott calculated a 141 2/3% chance to win, a line WCW fans still quote today. He stood there and factored in Kurt Angle's chances and referenced various insiders, concluding with complete confidence in numbers that were mathematically impossible but delivered with total conviction. Scott's feuds during this period became legendary, but not always for the right reasons. The Diamond Dallas Page storyline was built around Scott's obsession with Page's wife Kimberly, with Scott making crude comments about her during promos that pushed the boundaries of what WCW would allow on television. The storyline was controversial and uncomfortable, but it generated genuine heat for Scott's character. This was the same period when Scott's real-world volatility was escalating, like his November 28, 1998 incident with a Department of Transportation worker in Atlanta that made the newspapers. The line between his character's aggression and his actual behavior was disappearing completely. His Best of 7 series with Booker T showed flashes of his old technical brilliance, but it was overshadowed by his increasingly erratic behavior. The series took place in 2006 when both men were past their physical primes, but they still managed to put together some solid matches. Scott's technical skills were still there when he wanted to use them. He could chain wrestle and execute complex moves when he focused on the wrestling instead of the character work. But too often during this series, Scott would go off script or add elements that weren't part of the planned match. Backstage, Scott had become a walking powder keg that management couldn't control. His conflicts with Vince Russo turned into real confrontations that affected entire storylines, with Scott refusing segments he felt made him look weak. WCW had to deal with filming suspensions when Scott wouldn't cooperate, and there were incidents like the Nature Boy parking lot chase that showed just how volatile he'd become. Fellow wrestlers were genuinely intimidated by Scott's steroid-enhanced physique. When he got angry about something, his physical presence made every disagreement feel potentially dangerous. Nobody knew what would set Scott off or how he'd react to criticism, creating an atmosphere where people walked on eggshells around him. Creative control became Scott's obsession, and he'd refuse to do storylines that he felt made him look weak or stupid. Scott had developed very specific ideas about how his character should be presented. He wanted to look strong and dominant in every situation. If a storyline called for him to lose a match or look foolish, Scott would push back against it. He felt that his character's credibility was more important than whatever story the writers were trying to tell. This desire for creative control created constant friction with the writing team. Scott would demand changes to scripts and storylines right up until showtime. Sometimes he'd refuse to do segments that had already been written and rehearsed. This made it extremely difficult for WCW to use Scott in complex storylines because they never knew if he'd actually follow through with what they'd planned. The intimidation wasn't just about Scott's size. It was also about his unpredictable personality. Some wrestlers would avoid confronting Scott about anything because they didn't want to deal with the potential consequences. This dynamic made Scott difficult to work with and created problems for anyone who had to collaborate with him on storylines or matches. Other wrestlers would have to pick sides or try to stay neutral when Scott and management were having problems. Scott had become the most unpredictable performer in WCW, which made him compelling television but impossible to work with. His mathematical promos were quotable and his feuds generated heat, but behind the scenes, he was burning bridges with everyone from management to fellow wrestlers. The same intensity that made Big Papa Pump a memorable character was making Scott Steiner unemployable. When WCW folded in 2001, Scott's reputation preceded him. Every major promotion knew about his backstage issues, his creative demands, and his volatile personality. The question wasn't whether Scott could still wrestle. It was whether anyone would be willing to deal with everything that came with hiring him. WWE finally took a chance on Scott in November 2002, but his WCW swagger met WWE's tight scripts, and it stumbled. The crowd at Madison Square Garden went crazy when Scott interrupted Matt Hardy and Chris Nowinski during the Survivor Series. He took both guys down with clotheslines and suplexes that reminded everyone why they'd missed him. Both Raw and SmackDown wanted to sign him, and Eric Bischoff won the bidding war to bring Scott to Raw. The initial buzz was huge. WWE had one of WCW's biggest stars back, and everyone thought this was going to be Scott's chance to prove he belonged in the main event. WWE's corporate environment was completely different from WCW's chaos, and Scott couldn't adapt to their structured approach. WCW had let Scott do whatever he wanted during his Big Papa Pump run. He could cut unscripted promos and change storylines on the fly. WWE didn't work that way. They had writers who planned everything in advance. They had corporate executives who approved every segment. Scott was used to having creative control over his character, but WWE wanted him to follow their scripts and their vision for what Big Papa Pump should be. The culture clash was obvious from the start. WWE officials expected Scott to show up on time, follow directions, and work within their system. Scott had spent years in WCW doing things his own way. He wasn't used to being told exactly what to say or how to present his character. The structured approach that worked for other WWE wrestlers felt restrictive to someone who'd been given free rein for so long. His feuds with Triple H and Test were supposed to establish him as a main event player, but something was clearly wrong. WWE immediately put Scott in a program with Triple H, who was the World Heavyweight Champion at the time. This should have been a dream feud between two of wrestling's biggest stars. Instead, WWE reduced it to segments like their arm wrestling and bench press competition combo that completely missed what made Scott's character work. The same volatility that made him impossible to work with in WWE was about to create much bigger problems outside the ring. Scott's legal troubles began piling up in the 2000s with multiple assault and terroristic threat charges that painted a picture of someone who had completely lost control of his temper and his actions. These weren't minor disputes that got blown out of proportion. These were serious criminal charges that showed Scott's aggressive behavior wasn't limited to his wrestling character. It had become part of who he was in real life. The charges revealed a pattern of violence that extended far beyond the wrestling ring into his everyday interactions with people. One of the most disturbing incidents happened on April 21, 1998, when Scott threatened and struck an Atlanta Department of Transportation worker with his truck. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment reaction during a wrestling show. This was Scott using his vehicle as a weapon against a city employee who was just doing his job. The incident showed how Scott's real-world aggression had reached dangerous levels, where he was willing to use physical violence against complete strangers over minor disagreements. The assault charges and restraining orders painted a picture of someone whose real-life aggression had spiraled completely out of control. Court documents detailed incidents where Scott's behavior crossed the line from heated arguments into physical violence. The restraining orders weren't just temporary measures, they were legal protections that people felt they needed to stay safe around Scott. This was the same man who had once been known for his professionalism and dedication to wrestling. Now he was someone that people in his own life feared. Court appearances became regular occurrences for Scott. and each new legal issue made wrestling promoters more reluctant to book him. Every time Scott's name appeared in the news, it was connected to another arrest or court date. Wrestling promoters started viewing Scott as too much of a risk to put on their shows. They worried about negative publicity and potential liability issues. If Scott got arrested again while working for their company, it could damage their reputation and create legal problems for them too. The pattern of legal troubles wasn't just about individual incidents. It was about Scott becoming unreliable as a business partner. Promoters couldn't count on him to show up for events because he might be dealing with court dates or legal issues. They couldn't trust him to behave professionally at their shows because his real-life problems were affecting his ability to separate his personal issues from his work. This made Scott toxic to wrestling companies that needed dependable performers. Scott's confrontational behavior extended beyond legal troubles into shoot interviews and backstage altercations that showed a man who couldn't separate his character from his real personality anymore. The Chester incident where he bid to run over a DOT worker, the EMT assault at Greensboro where he attacked someone he thought was part of a wrestling angle, and his brawl with Diamond Dallas Page all demonstrated that Scott's aggression wasn't confined to scripted storylines. These weren't worked fights designed to build heat. They were real altercations where people got hurt, and Scott's size and strength made every situation potentially dangerous. The EMT incident was particularly telling because Scott was arrested and charged with criminal assault after attacking someone during a WCW television taping. The charges were eventually dropped when it was determined that Scott genuinely believed the EMT was an actor, but the incident showed how completely he had lost the ability to distinguish between wrestling and reality. This was someone who couldn't tell the difference between a real emergency medical technician and a wrestling performer. Industry relationships that had taken years to build were destroyed overnight as promoters decided Scott was too much of a liability. Wrestling is a relationship-based business where trust and reliability are essential. Scott's legal troubles made it impossible for promoters to trust him. They couldn't count on him to show up without creating problems. They couldn't depend on him to behave professionally around other wrestlers and staff members. Years of building connections in the wrestling business were wiped out by Scott's inability to control his behavior. The cumulative impact of Scott's legal issues became clear as major incidents continued piling up. The 2005 airline incident and the 2015 airport threat against Hulk Hogan's wife Jennifer showed that Scott's problems weren't getting better with time. They were getting worse. Each new incident reinforced the perception that Scott was someone wrestling companies couldn't afford to be associated with. The man who had once been a respected NCAA champion was now someone that wrestling companies actively avoided. Scott's legal troubles revealed that the Big Papa Pump character wasn't just an act. It had become who he really was. The transformation from respected athlete to controversial liability was complete, and the wrestling industry had taken notice. Major promotions had closed their doors to Scott, leaving him to figure out what came next in a career that had spiraled completely out of control. The independent wrestling scene became Scott's new home, though it wasn't quite the wrestling purgatory people expected. His 2006 TNA return at Destination X showed he could still draw for major promotions when they were willing to take the risk. Scott aligned with Jeff Jarrett and feuded with Sting and Samoa Joe, proving that Big Papa Pump still had value as a special attraction. He even captured the WWA World Heavyweight Championship, showing that smaller promotions were eager to put titles on him for the name recognition alone. But most of Scott's work was on the independent circuit, where promoters knew that booking Big Papa Pump would put people in seats. The crowds were smaller and the pay was worse than his WCW and WWE days. But Scott still had name recognition that independent promoters couldn't ignore. These smaller promotions needed names that would sell tickets, and Scott's reputation was enough to generate interest even if his in-ring abilities had declined significantly. The internet had given Scott's career a second life in ways he probably never expected. Modern fans who discovered Scott through internet memes embraced both his legitimate wrestling skills and his entertainment value as a spectacle. The Steiner math promo had become legendary online, and younger fans who hadn't seen Scott during his peak were discovering him through YouTube videos and social media clips. His NWA Hall of Fame roast became another viral moment that reminded people why Big Papa Pump was impossible to ignore. These fans appreciated Scott's absurdity without necessarily understanding the context of his career decline. They saw him as an entertaining character rather than a fallen star. People would attend independent shows specifically to hear Scott cut promos and see if he'd say something quotable. His mathematical calculations and sexual bragging had become part of wrestling folklore. Fans would chant along with his catchphrases and laugh at his outrageous claims about his physical superiority. The contrast between his current appearances and his championship days with Rick created a strange nostalgia among wrestling fans. Older fans who remembered the Steiner brothers' technical excellence would watch Scott's matches with mixed emotions. They could see flashes of the athlete he used to be, but those moments were overshadowed by his physical limitations and his commitment to the Big Papa Pump character. The gap between past and present was impossible to ignore. Scott's matches were a far cry from the athletic exhibitions he'd put on during the Steiner brothers era. His mobility was limited, and he couldn't execute the complex moves that had made him famous, especially after his 2020 heart scare that illustrated the serious health toll his career had taken. Instead, Scott relied on his character work and his intimidating presence to carry matches. The wrestling was secondary to the spectacle of Big Papa Pump flexing and cutting promos. Scott continued using the Big Papa Pump character because it was all he had left. The technical wrestler from the Steiner brothers era was long gone. His body couldn't handle the demands of technical wrestling anymore, but he could still pose and flex and cut bizarre promos. The character had become his identity, and Scott seemed unable or unwilling to develop anything new. He was stuck playing a role that had been created over a decade earlier, even though his physical condition made it increasingly difficult to maintain. The commitment to the character was both admirable and sad to watch. Scott would still do the flexing routine even when his body clearly wasn't what it used to be. He'd still make outrageous claims about his physical superiority even when everyone could see he was past his prime. The dedication to Big Papa Pump showed Scott's professionalism, but it also highlighted his inability to adapt to his changing circumstances. His relationship with fans became complicated. They cheered for him ironically while also respecting his legitimate athletic achievements. People would cheer when Scott flexed, but it wasn't the same kind of heat he generated during his WCW peak. The cheers were often mocking, with fans enjoying the absurdity rather than being genuinely impressed. At the same time, older fans who remembered Scott's technical skills would show genuine appreciation for his past accomplishments. Independent promoters booked Scott as a special attraction rather than a sustained main event draw. They wanted the name, recognition, and the potential for memorable moments, but they understood his limitations. Instead of being positioned as a main event star, he was treated more like a novelty act. Promoters would use him to generate interest in their shows, but they wouldn't build entire storylines around him. This internet revival led to his 2017 TNA Slam-miversary appearance, and eventually, the 2022 WWE Hall of Fame induction he had previously mocked. When WWE announced that the Steiner brothers would be inducted, it marked a reconciliation between Scott and the wrestling establishment. Scott had previously called the Hall of Fame honor of zero merits, but he seemed genuinely appreciative when the recognition finally came. Scott's independent career showed a man trying to maintain relevance in a business that had moved past him. Next up, Sid Eudy. Sid Eudy was one of wrestling's most intimidating giants, whose unhinged character and explosive power moves made him a two-time champion in both WWE and WCW. However, in 1993, a brutal hotel room fight left Arn Anderson stabbed with scissors and Sid himself bleeding from multiple wounds, forever altering his career trajectory. This shocking, violent incident is just one piece of the puzzle in understanding Sid Eudy, the legend who WWE has mysteriously blackballed from the Hall of Fame. In 1960, Sidney Raymond Eudy entered the world in rural Arkansas. Those early years shaped not just the man, but the monster who would later dominate wrestling rings across America. Growing up on an Arkansas farm forged Sid through physical labor. Day after day, farm life sculpted his frame naturally. He hauled, lifted, and worked from sunrise to sunset, building what would become one of wrestling's most impressive physiques through practical work rather than through gyms or trainers. By adulthood, Sid towered at 6 feet 9, the kind of height that commands attention wherever you go. But what makes Sid's story truly fascinating is how dramatically different his path was from most wrestling superstars of his era. While future legends like Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart grew up idolizing wrestlers and dreaming of the ring, Sid had absolutely no interest in professional wrestling. None. Zero. For most of his early adult life, becoming a wrestler never crossed his mind. He didn't collect wrestling figures, didn't watch matches on TV, didn't practice moves with his friends. Wrestling simply wasn't on his radar. This complete indifference makes the story of his wrestling discovery all the more remarkable. According to Sid himself, he was just working out at a local gym when fate stepped in, wearing neon fringe and sunglasses. The legendary Macho Man Randy Savage spotted him across the weight room, approached this imposing figure, and asked point-blank if he'd ever considered wrestling professionally. But wrestling stories often come with contradictions, and this origin tale is no exception. Lanny Poffo, Randy Savage's brother, remembers a completely different scenario. In Poffo's version, Sid actively sought out his opportunity, approaching Poffo at a Memphis wrestling show and directly asking how to break into the business. Two entirely different accounts of the same pivotal moment. Was Sid discovered while minding his own business, or did he deliberately seek his opportunity? We may never know the truth, but what's clear is that Sid's entry into wrestling wasn't driven by passion or childhood dreams. His motivation was purely practical. When his wife became pregnant, Sid needed steady income, and he needed it quickly. As he bluntly put it, "My wife got pregnant, and it sounded like I could get into that making more a little bit faster. No romantic notions about artistic expression. Just a tall guy with bills to pay and a baby on the way." This pragmatic approach distinguished Sid from the beginning. While many wrestlers speak of sacrificing everything for their love of the business, Sid viewed wrestling exactly as it was: a job. A way to provide for his family that happened to pay better than his alternatives. That doesn't mean he didn't work hard. Early footage shows a raw but captivating presence. During one of his first televised matches in Continental Championship Wrestling, Sid manhandled his opponent with such convincing power that fans at ringside visibly recoiled. Even as a rookie, he moved with an athleticism that belied his massive frame. Opponents looked genuinely intimidated, and for good reason. His natural gifts allowed rapid progression despite his late start. While other newcomers struggled for years in obscurity, promoters immediately recognized Sid's potential. That imposing presence and natural athleticism couldn't be taught, and you can almost see the wheels turning in promoters' minds as they watched his early matches. His quick rise created resentment among wrestlers who had paid their dues through years of low-paying matches. But Sid wasn't concerned with the traditional path or pleasing the locker room. He focused on maximizing his earning potential in the shortest time possible. This business-first mentality defined Sid's entire career. While others became entangled in creative politics, Sid consistently made decisions based on one factor: which option would put the most money in his pocket. In an industry notorious for exploiting performers, Sid's approach was refreshingly self-protective. He understood his value in a business where size and presence were premium commodities. If a promotion wasn't offering what he felt he was worth, he walked away, displaying rare leverage in a business where most wrestlers feared unemployment above all. The irony? Sid's lack of childhood wrestling fandom became his greatest asset. Without rose-colored glasses, he saw the business clearly for what it was: a business. He wasn't blinded by glory or trapped by dreams of legacy. He was there to get paid, and this clarity guided every career decision. This mindset helped him navigate the cutthroat wrestling world effectively. While many peers ended up broken, Sid's pragmatism protected both his finances and physical well-being. He knew when to push for more and when to walk away. His rapid ascent is remarkable considering his complete lack of passion for wrestling. While technical wizards like Bret Hart spent decades perfecting their craft, Sid reached comparable success with raw presence and business savvy alone. In less than 2 years from his debut, he commanded a major promotion salary most veterans only dreamed of. Throughout his career, this practical approach led to both his greatest successes and most controversial moments. Sid never pretended to be what he wasn't, a wrestling purist or a company man. He was a businessman in a business often pretending to be something else. For a man with no wrestling passion, Sid's first character required him to become completely unrecognizable. Continental Championship Wrestling didn't introduce the world to Sid Eudy. They unleashed Lord Humongous, a hockey-masked monster straight from apocalyptic cinema. This inspired choice to hide their physically impressive new talent behind a mask was wrestling genius at its most practical. When Sid stepped into the ring as Lord Humongous in 1987, few realized they were witnessing the birth of a future world champion. The character, shamelessly stolen from the film Mad Max 2. The Road Warrior featured Sid in a hockey mask, studded leather outfit, and carrying a chain. This mask became a veil that concealed both his identity and his vulnerabilities, allowing his imposing physicality to speak where his experience couldn't. The brilliance of the Lord Humongous gimmick was twofold. First, it completely concealed Sid's identity, allowing him to make rookie mistakes without damaging his future marketability. Second, it capitalized on his intimidating physical attributes while minimizing the need for technical wrestling proficiency. Fans didn't expect a complex wrestling match from a post-apocalyptic madman. They wanted destruction. Behind that mask, something remarkable was happening. Despite his raw inexperience, Sid was already displaying the physical presence that would define his career. His movements were limited but impactful. His offense was basic but believable. Most importantly, even beneath layers of costume, you couldn't hide that imposing 6'9" frame that moved with surprising athleticism for someone so large. The Lord Humongous character worked because it emphasized Sid's natural strengths. The mask and minimal speaking requirements focused audience attention entirely on his intimidating presence. He wasn't expected to deliver technical masterpieces. He was there to dominate. This formula of presence over technique would become the blueprint for his entire career. Continental Championship Wrestling operated primarily in Alabama and the surrounding Southern Territories, far from the national spotlight of WWF or even the regional power of Jim Crockett Promotions. This smaller territory provided the ideal environment for Sid to develop his skills away from mainstream scrutiny. Here, he could work matches against experienced veterans who could guide him through the fundamentals while teaching him how to maximize his obvious physical gifts. Sid's development took an unexpected international turn when he toured with New Japan Pro Wrestling as Vicious Warrior. This overseas excursion transformed his trajectory, as New Japan specifically groomed him to be the next Bruiser Brody, one of the most feared and respected gaijin, foreign wrestlers in Japanese history. The Bruiser Brody comparison was no accident. Brody had built his legendary status through his wild, brawling style and intimidating presence rather than technical wrestling excellence. This blueprint provided the perfect developmental path for Sid, reinforcing that his imposing size and menacing demeanor could be more valuable than complex wrestling maneuvers. These international tours forged crucial dimensions in Sid's arsenal. Japanese wrestling's stiffer style hardened his strikes, adding credibility to his offense. The grueling tour schedule built his conditioning and durability. Most significantly, exposure to Japanese psychology taught him how to maximize impact with minimal movement. A lesson that would pay dividends throughout his career as he moved between American promotions with different stylistic expectations. Back in America, Sid evolved into Sid Vicious in World-Class Championship Wrestling, borrowing from the infamous Sex Pistols bassist. This name change marked his emergence from behind the mask, developing a character with an edge of unpredictability and danger that matched his intimidating look. The Sid Vicious identity accomplished something crucial. It provided a persona that could travel between promotions and territories. Unlike Lord Humongous, which was tied to a specific visual presentation, Sid Vicious could evolve and adapt. This flexibility would prove valuable as Sid navigated between major promotions throughout his career. These early character iterations established the template that would carry Sid to multiple world championships. From Lord Humongous to Vicious Warrior to Sid Vicious, each character emphasized intimidation and power. His formative experiences across different territories and countries taught Sid exactly where his value lay in the wrestling industry. These smaller territories served as the perfect incubator for Sid's developing persona. Unlike today's wrestlers who often debut on national television with minimal experience, Sid benefited from this more traditional path. Continental Championship Wrestling and his international tours kept him hidden from mainstream audiences while he learned his craft, preventing fans from witnessing his inevitable rookie mistakes. This strategic development was far from accidental. Wrestling promoters have long understood that giants require special handling. For every Undertaker who succeeds on the biggest stage, countless other big men fail because they're exposed too early. By keeping Sid in smaller territories and behind masks, promoters protected their investment while giving him time to develop the fundamentals. The wrestling business has always excelled at maximizing assets. In Sid, they had a physical specimen with natural charisma and intimidating presence, but limited technical ability and experience. The solution? Create characters that emphasized his strengths and masked his weaknesses. Lord Humongous couldn't execute a perfect armbar, but he didn't need to. He just needed to look terrifying and hit hard. By the time Sid was ready for national exposure, he had internalized the most important lesson for someone of his size. Wrestling didn't need to be complex to be effective. His early characters had taught him that presence, intensity, and a few devastating power moves could carry him further than technical excellence ever would. This formula would propel him to championship glory across his career. National exposure was calling, and in 1989, Sid answered by joining WCW as one half of the Skyscrapers, a tag team so physically imposing that promoters practically salivated at their potential. Standing nearly 7 feet tall alongside Dan Spivey, the duo created an instant visual impact that few tag teams in wrestling history could match. When these twin towers entered the ring, announcers would frantically emphasize their combined height of almost 14 feet, making them look like giants compared to most of their opponents. The Skyscrapers demolished jobbers with ruthless efficiency, showcasing their raw power and intimidation factor. Television audiences quickly took notice of these behemoths, who tossed grown men around the ring like rag dolls. With their matching black tights and boots, they presented a unified front of destruction that positioned them for a major push up the card. WCW executives capitalized on their towering presence. In an era where size reigned supreme, they had secured two massive specimens who could credibly challenge any team in the company. Their push followed a calculated blueprint. Squash matches built their credibility while protecting them from potential in-ring weaknesses. For Sid specifically, this partnership provided the perfect vehicle to showcase his intimidating presence without exposing his limited experience. The Skyscrapers' impressive foundation began to crumble during a high-profile match against the Steiner brothers at the November 1989 Clash of the Champions event. Sid suffered a punctured lung and broken rib, legitimate injuries that immediately halted the team's momentum and sidelined him when championship gold seemed inevitable. During his recovery period, a career-defining pattern emerged. Rumors circulated that Sid had been spotted playing softball, his true passion, while supposedly too injured to perform in the ring. This information reached WCW management, particularly Booker Ole Anderson, who viewed this behavior as a cardinal sin against wrestling's unwritten code of paying dues. The consequences materialized when Sid returned 7 months later. Like a skyscraper suddenly missing its structural support, his carefully constructed character came crashing down. In what many insiders considered deliberate punishment, Sid was booked to lose to Lex Luger in a shocking 26 seconds. For a performer of Sid's stature and previous push, this kind of squash match was practically unheard of. Big men in wrestling were typically protected at all costs. The message from management was clear. Softball might be your passion, but wrestling pays your bills, and disrespect won't be tolerated. Despite this humbling return, Sid's commanding presence proved too valuable to ignore in the star-hungry wrestling landscape of 1990. In one of wrestling's most unexpected developments, Sid found himself inducted into the prestigious Four Horsemen faction, widely considered wrestling's most elite stable. Alongside the legendary Ric Flair, Sid served as the group's intimidating enforcer, a role that elevated his status virtually overnight. Joining the Four Horsemen was comparable to a rookie basketball player being drafted directly onto the Dream Team. This faction represented excellence in professional wrestling, typically reserved for the most talented performers in the business. Sid's inclusion spoke volumes about how management viewed his potential, despite the softball incident. Under the Horsemen's banner, Sid's profile rose dramatically. The association with Flair, arguably the greatest wrestler of all time, gave him instant credibility, while the stable's heel alignment perfectly suited his intimidating demeanor. When WrestleMania 8 finally arrived on April 5, 1992, at the Hoosier Dome in Indianapolis, the Hogan-Sid main event was already fighting an uphill battle. Would the match deliver enough action to overcome the pre-show disappointment? Could Sid cement himself as a worthy WrestleMania headliner? The match itself was serviceable if unspectacular. Exactly what you'd expect from a Hulk Hogan match of the era, with plenty of power moves but limited technical wrestling. But what about the finish? After Hogan hit his signature leg drop finisher, Sid kicked out at the last possible moment, 2.9 seconds into the count. The problem? The referee counted to 3 anyway, creating a botched finish that left everyone confused. Fans in the arena could clearly see Sid's shoulder up before the 3 count, but the match was called in Hogan's favor regardless. The botched finish created an awkward moment that perfectly encapsulated Sid's run in the company, something that should have worked on paper but somehow went sideways in execution. Behind the scenes, the situation was even messier. Around WrestleMania time, Sid had failed a drug test under the company's substance abuse policy, adding another complication to his already troubled run. In a decision that revealed much about the WWF's selective enforcement of its own policies, the company allowed Sid to work both WrestleMania and the subsequent European tour before serving his suspension. This arrangement highlights how differently the rules were applied to main event talent versus mid-card performers, especially during this era. What happened next would establish Sid's reputation for making unexpected career decisions. Rather than serve his suspension and return to what was still a prominent position in the company, Sid quit the WWF altogether. His reason? Softball. In one of wrestling's most unusual career priorities, Sid chose returning to his recreational softball league over continuing his main event run in the world's largest wrestling promotion. This decision seems incomprehensible to most wrestling fans who couldn't imagine anyone walking away from a WrestleMania main event position to play amateur sports. But for Sid, who had always viewed wrestling primarily as a money-making venture rather than a passion, the decision made perfect sense. The softball decision perfectly illustrated the fundamental difference between Sid and most of his colleagues. While other wrestlers would sacrifice everything for a main event spot, Sid repeatedly demonstrated that wrestling was simply a job to him, one he was willing to walk away from when it no longer suited his lifestyle or priorities. What makes this career detour even more remarkable is that Sid was scheduled to enter a significant program with the Ultimate Warrior upon his return from suspension. This wasn't a case of a wrestler being pushed down the card. Sid was walking away from a guaranteed high-profile position that most wrestlers would have killed for. In interviews years later, Sid would attribute his departure to multiple factors beyond just softball. He expressed frustration with the direction of his character and acknowledged that the failed drug test had complicated his standing in the company. But regardless of the full reasoning, the abrupt nature of his exit became yet another chapter in his increasingly unpredictable career narrative. While softball might seem like the strangest chapter in Sid's career, it pales in comparison to what happened in a Blackburn, England hotel room in 1993. 24 stab wounds, 2 bleeding wrestlers, and a championship opportunity that would vanish in a pool of blood. The infamous scissors incident became the night Sid Eudy nearly became a murderer. After his abrupt WWF departure, Sid found himself back in WCW in 1993. This time, he arrived with a new presentation as the mystery client of flamboyant manager Colonel Robert Parker. The promotion quickly paired him with the monstrous Vader to form one of wrestling's most physically intimidating tag teams, the aptly named Masters of the Powerbomb. With 2 of wrestling's most imposing figures destroying opponents with devastating powerbombs, WCW seemed to have a winning formula on their hands. What makes the scissors incident so significant in wrestling lore is how it represents a genuine career derailment. Wrestling history is filled with backstage fights that became part of a performer's mythology without significantly altering their career trajectory. But for Sid, this was different. In a single night, he went from being positioned as the next world champion to unemployable by a major promotion. The timing couldn't have been worse. WCW was entering a period of creative renaissance under Eric Bischoff's leadership, and the World Championship opportunity would have positioned Sid at the center of this new era. Instead, he spent the next 2 years working in smaller promotions like the USWA, rebuilding his reputation and waiting for the major companies to call again. Perhaps most tragically, the scissors incident cemented a perception of Sid that had been building throughout his career. That for all his physical gifts and charisma, he was ultimately too unpredictable and volatile to be trusted with a company's top position. While his imposing size and look had repeatedly earned him second and third chances despite earlier controversies, the extreme nature of the scissors incident tested the limits of wrestling's notorious forgiveness for marketable talent. 2 years after the bloody scissors incident, the wrestling world witnessed something that defied all conventional career logic. Sid Eudy, the man who had been fired for one of the most violent backstage altercations in history, was suddenly back on WWF television in 1995 as Psycho Sid. Even more surprising? He wasn't languishing in the undercard. He was immediately positioned as the imposing bodyguard for then WWF champion Shawn Michaels, one of the company's biggest stars. The wrestling business has always operated under its own strange moral code, but Sid's return exposed its most fundamental truth. Box office appeal trumps everything, even personal animosity. According to former WWF writer Bruce Pritchard, Vince personally couldn't stand Sid, but he knew money when he saw it. World Wrestling Federation was hemorrhaging top talent to rival World Championship Wrestling, which had deeper pockets thanks to Ted Turner's backing. With stars like Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and others jumping ship, McMahon needed established names who could connect with audiences immediately. The Psycho prefix added to Sid's name was a deliberate acknowledgement of his reputation. WWF leaned into his volatile history, presenting him as an unpredictable force of nature. The message couldn't have been clearer. In professional wrestling, marketability outweighs all other considerations, even morality. Sid's triumph also exposed an uncomfortable reality about wrestling's power structure. While wrestlers themselves face strict codes of loyalty and are expected to pay dues, promoters operate under no such restrictions. They'll welcome back almost anyone, regardless of past transgressions, if they believe that person can sell tickets or boost ratings. The same McMahon, who reportedly disliked Sid personally, had no qualms about placing the company's most prestigious title around his waist when business demanded it. The championship reign legitimized Sid in ways his impressive physique and intimidating presence alone never could. He was now officially recognized as a performer who could carry a company even if just temporarily. For a man who entered the business relatively late and approached it pragmatically, this validation must have been particularly satisfying. Holding that prestigious WWF championship should have cemented Sid as an all-time great. But here's the strangest part. A man with 4 world titles across 2 major promotions barely registers in conversations about wrestling legends. How could someone with championship credentials matching Hogan and Flair somehow fade into wrestling's second tier? The answer reveals wrestling's harsh truth. Timing is everything. When Sid claimed the WWF Championship at Survivor Series 1996, he embraced a new character evolution. The master and ruler of the world persona capitalized on his intimidating presence, giving fans a dominant champion whose physical stature made his title reign believable. Standing in the ring with his arms raised, championship gold wrapped around his waist, Sid finally had the validation that had eluded him for years. Fans initially responded with genuine enthusiasm, chanting his name as he posed with his newly won gold. But a strange phenomenon was occurring in arenas across America. Despite Sid standing tall as the company's champion, The crowd's attention was increasingly drawn to a brewing feud between Bret the Hitman Hart and Stone Cold Steve Austin. Their collision at WrestleMania 13 would become one of wrestling's most influential matches, setting the stage for the Attitude Era that would revolutionize the business. Sid, despite being champion, found himself caught in the undertow of wrestling's changing tides. This unfortunate timing haunted his entire championship career. While Sid was establishing himself as a credible main event champion, the wrestling landscape shifted beneath his feet. Audiences evolved too, moving beyond their fascination with larger-than-life monsters who dominated opponents. Wrestling fans now demanded complexity, shades of gray, and character depth that Sid's straightforward power persona wasn't built to provide. Early 1997 brought the infamously known Lost Smile incident. Shawn Michaels appeared on Raw to announce he was vacating the WWF Championship he'd won from Sid, claiming a career-threatening knee injury. The circumstances surrounding this decision have been debated for decades. Was Michaels legitimately injured, or unwilling to lose the title to Undertaker at WrestleMania? This unexpected development created a power vacuum leading directly to Sid's second WWF Championship reign in February 1997, when he defeated Bret Hart to reclaim the title. On paper, this solidified his legacy. A two-time WWF champion who'd beaten both Michaels and Hart, two of the most respected technical wrestlers in history. Yet, as Sid celebrated his second coronation, veteran fans could sense the company's creative direction shifting away from his style of performer. This second reign lasted just over a month before culminating at WrestleMania 13 against The Undertaker. The match itself was solid, with Sid's power contrasting against Undertaker's methodical style. But again, Sid's moment was overshadowed. The same event featured the iconic Hart vs. Austin submission match that stole the show and redirected the company's creative trajectory. Sid became the streak's sixth victim, yet few remember this compared to the blood-soaked image of Steve Austin screaming in the sharpshooter. After departing WWF, Sid disappeared from major wrestling promotions for nearly 2 years. His 1999 return came with a repackaged identity as WCW's Millennium Man. This character attempted to capitalize on Y2K anxieties while borrowing from Bill Goldberg's undefeated streak formula. While fans initially popped for his return, the excitement quickly faded as WCW's creative confusion became apparent. WCW in 1999 showed serious signs of decline, with frequent booking changes and a roster bloated with aging stars. Sid's Millennium Man, while initially receiving a solid push, became another casualty of the company's chaotic direction. His attempts to build Goldberg-like momentum felt derivative rather than innovative, especially with Goldberg still competing in the same company. Despite these challenges, Sid captured the WCW World Heavyweight Championship twice in 2000. These achievements should have represented his career's culmination, validation across multiple companies and eras. Instead, they became footnotes in wrestling history, remembered more for occurring during WCW's death spiral than for memorable storylines or matches. Even as the championship was placed around his waist, television viewership continued to decline precipitously. By 2000, WCW was hemorrhaging money and viewers. The once mighty wrestling powerhouse that had dominated Monday night ratings for 83 consecutive weeks was making desperate creative decisions in failed attempts to recapture glory. Sid's championships came during this tumultuous period, with titles changing hands frequently and storylines abandoned before developing meaningful conclusions. How could one attempted move transform a 6'9" powerhouse into a cautionary tale that makes even hardened wrestling veterans wince 20 years later? January 14, 2001. WCW's Sin pay-per-view event in Indianapolis. The once mighty wrestling promotion was already on life support, hemorrhaging viewers and money at an alarming rate. But nobody in the Conseco Fieldhouse that night was thinking about corporate balance sheets when Sid Eudy climbed the turnbuckle during a four-way match for the World Heavyweight Championship. What happened next remains one of pro wrestling's most horrific moments captured on live. Several wrestlers had reportedly advised him against trying aerial maneuvers given his size and weight. At over 300 pounds and approaching his 40s, Sid was neither built nor trained for high-flying tactics. But in the competitive world of wrestling, where performers constantly push boundaries to stand out, caution often takes a backseat to spectacle. The moment unfolded with terrible inevitability. Sid leaped forward to deliver the boot, his massive frame coming down at an awkward angle. The human leg has structural limits, even one belonging to a physical spinner like a thunderclap of doom, silencing the crowd instantly. His tibia and fibula snapped, bones protruding through his wrestling boot in a catastrophic compound fracture. The camera caught the horrific moment before WCW production hastily cut away, but the damage was done, both to Sid and to everyone watching. The commentators fell silent, their usual hyperbole abandoned. The man who prioritized business decisions over wrestling passion faced the harsh reality that the business offered little loyalty in return. The legacy of this injury extends beyond Sid himself. The footage has become notorious, shown in edited form or described rather than displayed in full-on retrospectives. For an industry that regularly showcases theatrical violence, the genuine nature of Sid's injury proved too disturbing even for wrestling's theatrical standards. For younger wrestlers, Sid's injury serves as a sobering reminder of the physical risks inherent in the profession, particularly when attempting moves outside one's established repertoire. Wrestling schools reference the incident as a warning about respecting physical limitations and the consequences of overreaching. Despite the catastrophic nature of the injury, Sid remarkably returned to the ring years later. Though never again as a full-time performer, these limited appearances demonstrated both his physical resilience and continued appeal as a recognizable name from wrestling's past. That he could walk to the ring at all, much less perform, stands as testament to modern medical science and his remarkable determination. Sid's return to the ring after his catastrophic leg injury defies medical logic. Most athletes would have hung up their boots permanently after such trauma, but between 2004 and 2017, the imposing figure made several surprising comebacks. Perhaps most memorable was his 2012 appearance on WWE Raw, where, at 52 years old, he defeated Heath Slater with his trademark powerbomb. The crowd's thunderous reaction proved his character still resonated with fans, even as a nostalgia act. That reaction highlights wrestling's most puzzling contradiction. How can a man who headlined against Hulk Hogan and The Undertaker, who held world championships in both major companies, remain conspicuously absent from the WWE Hall of Fame, while wrestlers with far less impressive resumes receive their rings? The numbers speak volumes. 4 world championships across WWF and WCW. Multiple WrestleMania main events. A career spanning the industry's most profitable and culturally relevant eras. By any measurable standard, Sid's accomplishments warrant wrestling's highest honor. Yet year after year, when WWE announces its Hall of Fame class, his name remains noticeably absent. WWE's Hall of Fame stands as a sanctum of loyalty that Sid's pragmatic approach never penetrated. The company, as keeper of wrestling's official history, rewards those who demonstrated unwavering dedication. Sid's pattern of abrupt departures, leaving WWF for softball, exiting WCW after the scissors incident, and his various contract disputes, contradicts the company's preferred narrative of wrestlers who loved the business above all else. Vince McMahon reportedly never personally warmed to Sid, viewing him as a necessary talent during roster shortages rather than a cornerstone performer. In wrestling, personal relationships often supersede professional accomplishments, with being in the boss's good graces mattering as much as championship victories. The infamous scissors incident with Arn Anderson remains a black mark as well. While WWE has forgiven worse behaviors from other Hall inductees, the company selectively sanitizes which controversial moments it incorporates into its version of wrestling history. This real-world violence represents the kind of brutality WWE distances itself from in the PG era. Sid's transparent admission that wrestling was simply a job creates another barrier. In an industry built on the mythology of wrestlers paying dues and sacrificing everything, his financial prioritization makes him an uncomfortable anomaly. The Hall celebration typically frames inductees as lifelong dreamers who achieved their ultimate goal, not pragmatists who viewed wrestling as their most profitable career option. His promo style presents another complication. While genuinely intimidating at his best, his unintentional comedic moments have become immortalized through YouTube compilations and memes. WWE prefers to induct legends whose legacies they can control, rather than those colored by viral bloopers like his infamous, "I have half the brain that you do" flub. What makes this exclusion particularly striking is how it contrasts with similar performers who received the honor. The Ultimate Warrior, another physically impressive but technically limited performer with a history of walking out, was eventually inducted. Diesel, Kevin Nash, whose WWF Championship reign coincided with historically low business metrics, has his ring. Even Sid's contemporaries with shorter title reigns have been welcomed into the hall. Sid occupies an awkward position in wrestling's historical narrative. His career bridged the character-heavy 1980s and the edgier Attitude Era that followed. He wasn't quite the cartoon superhero of Hulkamania, nor the nuanced anti-hero that defined the late 1990s. Instead, Sid existed between wrestling's distinct generational identities, making his contribution harder to categorize in WWE's carefully curated mythology. This positioning makes Sid both historically significant and challenging to properly contextualize. He headlined against Hogan as the old guard faded, then later against Undertaker and Michaels as a new era dawned. Yet he's never given primary credit for either period's success. Wrestling documentaries focus on Hogan's twilight and Bret Hart's rise when recapping the early 1990s. In wrestling's reconstructed history, Sid becomes a supporting character in other wrestlers' stories rather than the protagonist of his own. The missing Hall of Fame ring reflects Sid's contradictory legacy. His physical attributes, the intimidating height, imposing physique, natural athleticism, represented everything promoters wanted in a top star. Yet his technical limitations, promo inconsistency, and business-first approach prevented him from becoming the definitive face of either major company despite multiple opportunities. This contradiction extends to fan perception. While hardcore wrestling fans may critique his in-ring limitations, casual viewers were consistently impressed by his presence. His powerbomb finisher looked devastating, his intense facial expressions conveyed menace, and his physical stature made victories over legendary opponents believable. The sustained crowd reactions throughout his career confirm that whatever Sid lacked in technical proficiency, he compensated for with undeniable charisma and presence. Perhaps the most fitting summary of Sid's career comes from understanding the unique space he occupied in wrestling history. He was neither the most technically gifted nor the most creatively invested performer, but few could match his physical presence or natural intimidation factor. His pragmatic approach likely preserved his financial and physical health better than many contemporaries who loved the business to their detriment. While wrestling glorifies those who sacrifice everything for the business, Sid Eudy's career reveals a different path. He openly treated wrestling as just a paycheck, yet walked away with his health and finances intact when many legends ended up broken and broke. The industry preaches passion and dedication, but Sid skipped this mythology. He showed up, got paid, and left when better opportunities arose. Ironically, promoters who publicly demanded loyalty couldn't resist throwing money at his imposing 6 feet 9 inches frame and natural intimidation factor. Sid bypassed wrestling's traditional dues-paying process. While others destroyed their bodies for $50 in high school gyms, he leveraged his physical presence for immediate six-figure contracts, making decisions based purely on financial gain rather than creative fulfillment. His most powerful negotiation tool wasn't his physique, but his genuine willingness to walk away, even for personal interests like softball. This shifted the power balance. Promoters knew his threats to leave were real because he'd proven it multiple times. In the end, Sid exposed wrestling's fundamental contradiction by treating it exactly as the business it is, not as the all-consuming passion its mythology demands. A philosophy he maintained until his death from cancer on August 26, 2024, at the age of 63. Check out our video on Big Van Vader. Like and subscribe for 100 years of luck. Until next time.